Hey folks, before we get started in this sermon, I want to mention to you that it's important that this sermon and this form of instruction is not your primary form of instruction. It is important for you to be involved in a church. Being involved in a church where you can receive preaching and teaching, but also the fellowship with one another. And so if you're not a part of a church, I really want to encourage you to get hooked into a church, and I think you'll find that you'll receive so many blessings by being part of a group of people that are seeking to honor God as they live this life. Having said that, let's go ahead and get started in the sermon today, and I do hope you receive a blessing from it. Contentment. It is an area I think that affects all of us. I think that at times we struggle with discontentment, with unhappiness, with frustration. I've learned in my 35 years in the ministry, and I've told other preachers this, if you want to preach a sermon where everybody comes up and gives you a hug and say, man, greatest sermon I've ever heard, you preach on trials and temptations and frustrations and hardships, because all of us can relate to that. And we like to kind of hear what God is doing, or at least try to find out what God's doing and how we can kind of get through that. The interesting thing is, though, I think that the issue of contentment affects us just as much as hardships do. All of us struggle with being satisfied. We're not satisfied with the way we look. We're not satisfied with our job. We're not satisfied with our marriage. We're not satisfied with the money we have in our bank account. Some folks are just not satisfied with anything in life. They seem to be unhappy with everything. Nothing seems to make them feel fulfilled. Now, for most of us, it's probably that we're content in some areas, but not in other areas. And so we see it's a subject matter that affects us all. I mean, think about it for a minute. You go back to Ecclesiastes, and if you all were here a few months back on our Wednesday night study, we studied the book of Ecclesiastes. And Solomon comes along, and he's looking for fulfillment. He's looking for satisfaction in something. And he has the ability and the money and the resources to look. And he looked for it in money. He looked for it in things. He looked for it in sex. He looked for it in power. He looked for it in building things. He looked for it in planting gardens. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, this is what he said: I hate life. Solomon went through a period that he couldn't find satisfaction. He couldn't find contentment. He couldn't find fulfillment. Yet we see that same principle in other people current. I mean, I mentioned a few weeks back Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was constantly looking for fulfillment and satisfaction in other things. He chased after women. He looked for it in influence. He looked for it in money. He seemed to have everything. He scoffed at God. He scoffed at the Bible, and he ended up killing himself. Even in our own time, just a couple years ago, Tom Brady, considered probably the greatest football or quarterback of all times. The guy had 4 Super Bowl rings, or 5 Super Bowl rings at that time. He also was married to a beautiful model. He had all kind of money, and he made this statement. He said, I just don't feel satisfied. We all struggle with contentment. But then we look at Paul. The Apostle Paul gave up everything to follow Christ. And he said, I've learned to be content. This is a guy that suffered multiple beatings, multiple stonings. He was shipwrecked. People were constantly out to ruin his reputation. And yet he says, I've learned to be content. Folks, we need to understand a couple things here about contentment before we continue to move on in our study. One is, it is a sin to be discontented, according to Hebrews. There's no reason for Christians not to be satisfied unless we've got our sights and our focus elsewhere. And the second thing is this: contentment is the greatest experience you will ever have in your life. It is the only thing that's going to cause you to want to get up every morning and face life. When you are content, when you are satisfied, when you are fulfilled, there is this sense that life really is an abundant joy. But see, for most of us, we never experience that because we're discontented. We're trying to get this. We're trying to go here. We're trying to achieve this. We're trying to chase after that. And the fact is, the reason we don't seek contentment is because we've never experienced how wonderful it is. That's why Paul said, look, I've learned contentment. Why? Because he understands just how great it is. And so we're going to look at the second part of it today, Philippians chapter 4. Let's review just last week very quickly. There are about 5, maybe 6 elements that allows us to become contented We looked at 3 last week. The first is contentment comes when you have an understanding of God's provision, which simply means that He is in control of all things. When you recognize that there's nothing that you are going through or will go through that God is not in control in, when you catch that, you're able to be content and allow Him to take care of it. Second of all, contentment only begins to happen when you learn to be satisfied with very little. If you're convinced that you have very little and the only way to be content is to have something else, then when you get that, you're not going to be content. It's just going to continue to multiply and become a cycle. When you learn to be content with very little, that's when you will learn contentment, because no matter how God blesses you, you'll be content. Third thing is this: contentment is not based upon circumstances. Paul said, I had nothing and I had everything, and I was able to be content. Circumstances does not affect your contentment. Whether you lose your job, whether you have rebellious children, whether you have a marriage that's falling apart, whether or not you don't have enough money in the bank, that does not affect your contentment. That's what Paul wants us to understand. There's 2 more things we need to understand regarding contentment. Stay with me. Verse 10, chapter 4 of Philippians. We read this last week. We'll work our way through it again. I rejoice greatly, and I mentioned to you that phrase is very important to us. It's a statement of thanksgiving. Next week, we will look at contentment part 3, and we will deal with being grateful. I think that's a key to contentment. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you've renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you've been concerned, but you have no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. We stop there. So we pick up in verse 13 today. I can do everything through Him who gives me strength. Yet it was good for you to share in my troubles. That's really important. You need to circle verse 14. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out for Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you only. For even when I was with you in Thessalonica, you sent me aid again and again and again when I was in need. Verse 17, circle this one. Not that I am looking for a gift, but I am looking for what may be credited to your account. I've received full payment, and even more, I am amply supplied now that I've received the gifts that you've sent me. They're fragrant offerings, acceptable sacrifices pleasing to God. Let's take a look at 2 more elements that brings us into contentment. The first one is this: we need to come to an understanding that there is a divine power available to us. We need to come to an understanding there's a divine power that's available to us. Now look, here's where it gets kind of interesting. Verse 13 says, I can do all things. I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me. Now the key phrase there is all things or everything. It's a very general word. We love this passage. We love to quote this passage. Most of the time, though, we quote it in regards to the everything, meaning that when we get through a tough time or we're going through a hard time, we say, I don't know how I did it, but it was because of God's strength. We lose a loved one. We lose a child. And before someone loses a child, they say, I couldn't handle it. If I lost my child, I just couldn't be able to handle it. But then they're in the midst of that situation, and they say, it's only through the strength of God that I'm able to do that. So we oftentimes use this verse to express hardships or difficulties that we didn't think we can go through, but we can because of God's strength. Or we accomplish things that we never thought we would be able to. We got to this certain level in our career or whatever it might be, and we say, it's only through the strength of God. Now, I'm not trying to say that's not what this passage is saying, because it does use the phrase everything. I can do everything to strengthen me. But good preaching, solid hermeneutics, solid Bible study keeps it in context. In context, the everything that Paul is talking about here is contentment. Paul says, I have learned to be content in every circumstance because of the strength of God. God gave me the strength to be content, whether I had little or whether I had a lot. That's what it is in context there, folks. Because, see, learning contentment is not something that once you learn it, you never forget it. Because Satan's job is to try to pull you away from contentment. David said this. He said, look, Lord, don't give me too little where I might reject you. But don't give me too much where I might forget you. And I think Paul struggled with this at times. I think when Paul went through the times when he didn't have very much, his thought was, what is God doing? Why don't I have much? I've given my whole life to Him. Why can't I have this? Why can't I have a home? Why can't I have some of the things that other people have? But yet it was through God's strength that Paul was able to be content. And then when Paul did have things, I think he probably struggled with that as well at times. I think he thought probably, you know what, I just keep moving forward. I just keep going. He easily lost his passion for Christ. Those things that he was finding to be in abundance in his life began to take the priority. And I think Paul had to step back and say, wait a minute, God, I need you to give me the strength to be content even though I have a lot. See, you're not going to be content just on your own. We're not built that way, and we don't live in a world that way that encourages contentment. You have to learn it. And part of learning it is understanding that God will give you the strength to be content in every circumstance, in every situation. Take a look, if you would, at what it says in Isaiah. Again, a passage we love. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. I think Paul understood this when it came to the issue of contentment. That when he was struggling with contentment, when Satan was pounding him, when Satan was trying to convince him to have this and to reach for this and to not be happy where he was, I think he found strength in God. That when he got exhausted and when he got wore out and when he didn't have enough or when he was struggling with what he had, that he had to gain his strength from Christ. Contentment, if it's something that you really understand how valuable and wonderful it is, and folks, it's amazing. Once you've ever experienced contentment, it's amazing. It is the great anxiety and stress reliever. You don't have to worry about what's next. You don't have to worry about getting that. You don't have to worry about paying for that, because what happens is as you receive what you receive from God, He gives it to you in such a way that you're able to be content and satisfied and not say, man, now I need to go to this. Very good friends we had up in Augusta, Georgia. When we first moved there, they had a nice home. It was a really nice home. It was in a really nice neighborhood. And we would go over there almost every Sunday, about 3 or 4 couples, because it worked out well. He had a screened-in porch with ceiling fans, had a TV out there. We'd go and watch the last round of the golf tournament. We'd cook out. We had a great time. It was just a wonderful home. Well, his brother got a bigger, nicer home in a nicer, more exclusive neighborhood. And he decided he needed that too. So him and his wife just began this desire. That's all they talked about. Got to get a home, got to get a better home, get a bigger home, got a bigger home, got to have it, got to have it. The home they had was beautiful. And I remember one of the reasons they told us was that, well, this is a bad neighborhood. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. It was a great neighborhood, as a matter of fact. The only thing they said was dangerous. The only thing that ever happened there was dangerous was a woman was walking on the sidewalk and someone accidentally hit them in a car. It was an accident. It wasn't a dangerous neighborhood. Accidents happen no matter where you are, but that was their reason. We got to go, we got to go. They found this beautiful home, probably cost them 3 times as much in a really nice neighborhood, same neighborhood the brother was in. We stopped going over there because they didn't have a place for us to meet. There was no really get-together spot. And when you got in the home, it was so elegant looking. You were afraid to touch anything. And it got to be where it was almost uncomfortable. And then they began to have problems in their marriage. And they ended up in a divorce, and they couldn't sell the house. Market was down. House was too big. All of a sudden, their desire for things had caused them to really begin to experience a dissatisfaction that they were so unhappy with everything in their life. That's what happens, folks. God gives you the strength to be content whether you have a little or whether you have a lot, whether you're going through this struggle or whether you're going through this struggle. He gives you the strength to do that. Now, where does the strength come from? It comes from being Christ sufficient. It's when you acknowledge, I can't do this on my own. I can't fix my marriage on my own. I can't fix the environment that I work at on my own. You have to become Christ sufficient. That's why in Galatians chapter 2, Paul very simply says, I have been crucified. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. You have to become Christ sufficient. Now, there's 2 parts to being Christ sufficient. The first is you have to have the relationship with Christ. So I'm going to share the gospel with you for a minute this morning. Now, many of you already know the gospel, but maybe some of you don't, or maybe some of you are not very clear about it. I want to share the gospel with you just for a moment, because that's the first step in contentment. Look, if you don't have Christ, you'll never have contentment. You'll chase things all day long, and it will be like that sugar high you get on. It'll get you here, and then it'll drop down, right? You buy that new vehicle, and it's great until what? The first payment comes in. Pow! Or the first scratch on it. Pow! That's how it works. And if you don't have Christ, if you don't have a relationship with Christ, you're not going to ever have contentment. You'll have happiness at times based upon things that you accumulate, but you're not going to have contentment, satisfaction, and fulfillment. So let me share the gospel with you. This is what I understand. Everyone has sinned. Everyone has sinned, the Bible says. If you don't think that you have, take the 10 Commandments, walk through them. If you committed one sin, you're separated from God. One sin separates you from God because God cannot be in the presence of sin. So everybody has sinned. Now here's the issue. Because everybody has sinned, because God has established the rules and established what the commandments are, and because He is holy, there has to be a consequence to sin. And He says the consequence of sin is death. Physical death? No. That did come in because of sin, but the death we're talking about is spiritual death, a separation from the Father. Sin separates you from the Father. That's the consequence of sin. Everybody with me to that point? Now here's the issue. Because God is holy, and we just sang about Him being holy, that means He is just. That means when someone commits a sin, He has to establish the consequences. He has to implement them. We watch these judges on TV or on Facebook or on social media, and when someone comes in and they've broken the law, sometimes he just, oh, okay, we'll just wipe it off and it'll go away. And we think, well, that's the way God can be. Why can't He just wipe it off and go away? The problem is those judges are not just. And they're also not fair sometimes, because a person commits this crime, he wipes it away, but someone that commits the very same crime over there, he might implement the consequence. God has to be just. So that means that when sin takes place, there has to be the consequence of sin, which is what? Separation from the Father. That's the consequence of sin. Everybody with me to that point? Okay? So we've all sinned, so we all must experience spiritual death. We must be separated from the Father because of our sin. But because God is full of love, He says, look, I can fix this. So He sends His Son down here who never sins, never commits a sin. And out of the Father's love and out of the Son's love, He dies for us. And He pays for our sin. Now here's where it gets interesting. What is the consequence of our sin? Separation from the Father. For how long? Forever. Well, Jesus died on the cross, right? That wasn't the payment for sin, folks. Jesus dying on the cross was not the payment for sin. Jesus dying on the cross was a sign of how much He loved us, because He endured the worst kind of death you could ever endure. Jesus could have been hanged, He could have been beheaded, but He died on the cross because that was the element of death. For criminals, it was the worst kind of death that anybody could ever experience, and probably the worst kind of death throughout history. He died on the cross to show His love to us. But that wasn't Jesus paying our consequence of sin, because the consequence of sin was separation from God. So Jesus had to be separated from God. How many days was Jesus separated from God? 3. So let's think about this for a minute. You're telling me that I can live however I want. I can act however I want. I can treat people the way I want. I can chase after sex. I can lie. I can do whatever I want. And the only penalty I have to pay is that I have to be separated from God for 3 days in hell? I'll do it. I can pull that bad boy off. I think I can. I know it's tough, but 3 days in hell so I can live however I want? That doesn't make sense. How can Jesus paying for our consequence of sins be 3 days in hell? It can't be. He had to spend eternity in hell, because that's what we would have had to do if He doesn't pay for our sins. So how's this work, Jim? You're really messing up my mind. That's right, because I'm making all this up as I go. We've heard this before, though, haven't we? And it's good stuff. You know it is. I've taught this before, one other time. So how does this work? The Bible says that when Jesus died, He went down to a place called the abode of the dead. The abode of the dead is a real place, or at least it's changed a little bit. I can't get into that right now. But in the abode of the dead, there's 2 parts. There's what's known as paradise, and there's what's known as Hades. Hades is hell. It was full of torment. There's thirst. There's anguish, all that. The Bible says that Jesus went to Hades because what He did when He died was He went and He taught and preached to the disobedient people from Noah's day. Well, they weren't in paradise, they were in Hades. So when Jesus died, He went to Hades and He spent eternity in Hades. How is that possible? Because you and I are trying to look at this from our finite mind. How many days is 1,000 years to God? 1. And how many 1,000 years is a day? I don't know how it is. You know how it goes. We're trying to look at this from a finite mind, and we can't. Here's what I'm here to tell you. The gospel is that Jesus Christ, as best as you can understand it, spent eternity in hell so that you and I didn't have to. That's the gospel. Then he's raised from the dead because he'd paid our penalty. And he says, all you have to do is accept my gift. All you have to do is accept my gift so that your sins are forgiven. Because see, as long as I got sin, I got to pay the consequences for it, right? I got to spend eternity. So I got to get my sins, I got to get rid of them. And how do we do that? Peter says, by putting your faith in Jesus Christ, repenting and being immersed, and you will receive the forgiveness of sin. That's the gospel. You do not have to spend eternity in hell because Jesus already has. But you do have to accept his gift through your faith in him. That's how you become Christ sufficient, because at that point you develop a relationship with him. Now, once that relationship is developed, let me tell you what happens. You now have to put your trust in him. See, now you've got to trust him. You just can't have a relationship with him. You have to trust him. And we've talked about this word trust before. It very simply is the concept that I don't just talk about trusting God, but I live it. I'm obedient. I do what God tells me to do. I live as God calls me to live. I ran across this quote. This fellow used to be, he's a preacher now, wrote a number of commentaries. He used to be an MD doctor. He says, health is the result of right living. Well, the same is true spiritually. The promises, and especially this promise of the strength of God so that you can have contentment, is the result of right spiritual living. It means doing what God has called you to do. At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, this is what Solomon says. He says, I found it. I found satisfaction. You know what it is? It's to fear God and to be obedient to him. That's satisfaction. So the way that we have the strength in order to be content no matter what we're facing is to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and then in that relationship with him, we trust him. We are obedient. We do what God tells us to do. Let me give you an example. Let's go to marriage for a minute, okay? Because marriage is fun. So let's say you're in a marriage and you're not very content. Your spouse is not proven to be what you thought your spouse was going to be. Now look, most of us can relate to that. I know that I am not the spouse that Lisa thought that she was getting in this package deal. I know that. I know that I am not her knight in shining armor. I'm more like the court jester. That's who I am in the marriage. And in fact, I've told you before, Lisa's term of endearment for me is doofus, because that's kind of how the relationship is sometimes. And so I know that I don't fulfill all her expectations, and I know that I'm not the perfect spouse for her. And the fact is, and I'm only saying this because she's not in here today. She's not everything that I thought she would be. She's got some great characteristics, and I know that you all know that. She's loving, but she's not. But that happens in our marriage. So it'd be very easy to be discontented in our marriage. But what you have to do is you have to back up and you say, okay, what does the Bible tell us? What's the revealed will of God when it comes to marriage? Well, husbands, you're to love your wife like Christ loved the church. And wives, you're supposed to be submissive to your husband. And husband and wives, you are never to deny sex to your spouse. Never. Unless it is an agreement. I notice Amber's not here either. You might want to make sure she doesn't see this on tape. But that's what it says. Unless there is an agreement and you come together, there is not to be a denying of meeting that physical need. Now look, you step back and you look at those things and you say, okay, am I doing those things? I'm telling you right now that if you follow God's revealed will when it comes to your marriage, you will be content. You'll be content. Might not be the perfect spouse, might be the exact spouse you were looking for, but you are content because you are doing God's revealed will. You are trusting him, and he gives you the strength to be content. But now look, that's dependent upon two. What if one of them won't have anything to do with it? What if one of them doesn't want to follow the things that God has established? Well, you know what? They have to deal with that in the presence of God. But what about you? Can you still have contentment? I think you can. Example is, God said in scriptures that if you as a Christian are married to a non-Christian, you don't leave them. You stay with them. Well, now a non-Christian probably doesn't really care what God says about marriage. But I believe that he says you stay with them because he's going to give you the strength to be content. Now, what's that mean? When you are content in your marriage, it means you love it. You're satisfied. You look forward to it. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. But if I love Lisa like Christ loved the church, and she is submissive as God has called her to be, and we are meeting each other's needs to the very best of our ability, we will be content in our marriage, even though it's not a perfect marriage. Because why? We received the strength from God to be content in our marriage and not to look elsewhere. And I don't mean other people necessarily, but at other things that seem to take us away from our marriage. That makes sense, doesn't it? Look, folks, that applies to everything. So the fourth thing that comes to contentment is that you have to understand there is a strength that's available to us to be content no matter what, but that contentment is dependent upon Christ's sufficiency. The second thing is this, or actually the fifth thing, I take two today, but fifth overall, is that contentment comes when we put our focus on other people. Take a look, if you would, at verse 14. Yet it was good for you to share in my troubles. And let me tell you why Paul put that in there. Some of the translations actually says nevertheless. Here's what's happened. This church hasn't been able to help Paul for 10 years. Now all of a sudden they send over this help for Paul, whatever it is, money, clothing, food, they send it over there. And they get this letter back, and this is what Paul says in the letter. Yeah, I appreciate it, but I didn't really need it. I was good. I was able to get along without it. I was okay with it. I can have it. I can take it, leave it. And you know, they got to be thinking, well, why in the world then did we send it? If he doesn't really need it, if he doesn't really care, why does he need it? And so Paul goes, well, wait a minute though. I do appreciate it. I rejoice about it. But what's more important is this. Look at verse 17. Not that I was looking for a gift, but I am looking for what may be credited to your account. Paul said, I'm grateful for the gift, but more for you. Paul's concern was about others. Contentment comes when your focus isn't on yourself, but when it's on other people. Now that's pretty tough, because we live in a world that says, think about you, think about you, think about you. But not only that, as human beings, here's what we do. When we see other people, we don't necessarily are concerned about them. We want to know why they're getting that and we're not. Why do they get to go on that kind of vacation? Why do they get that kind of vehicle? Why do they get that house? Why do they get that? Why don't we get that? Years ago, when Lisa had only been married maybe about, 5 or 6 years, we were still young, didn't have a lot of money, just getting started. I think we had maybe both the kids, I can't really be sure, but Lisa's folks, who probably were about 55, 60 at that time, took a cruise to Alaska. And I was so envious, because our vacation was going to see Lisa's folks and my folks. Yay! That was vacation. We were so excited about it. We're going on vacation. Can't wait. Where are we going? Lisa's folks. Oh, great. Okay. It's lovely. I was so envious because they're going on this vacation and they come back and they show these pictures, and there's whales and there's dolphins and there's seals and there's food. There's everything you could ever imagine. And I'm so envious. And all of a sudden one day I'm driving along and God began to kind of remind me, and I hate when he does this, and he says, look, when you get to 50, you can go on vacation like that. And sure enough, about the time we got rid of the kids, which is what God does. It's just when you get rid of the kids, good things happen, okay? If you're dumb enough to have kids, you got to deal with it. But once you get rid of them, woohoo! Okay, so that's kind of fun. That's how it works. That's how it works. But we started to get to go on some vacations that we didn't have to go to people's house. We could go to the mountains. We could go here, and all of a sudden things had changed. And I think that's what we do sometimes. We look at what other people have, and instead of being concerned for them, it only makes us more discontented. Paul says, no, look, I need you to look at other people and be concerned for them, because when you're concerned for them, then you're not worried about self. You can be content. And it's actually a double blessing here, I think, or a double teaching that he's given us. Because he says, look, because the church at Philippi had showed generosity to him, because they had been concerned about him, he said, you're going to profit from it. I think they had learned to be concerned for Paul because they had seen Paul be concerned about other people. And so what were they going to profit? Well, the scriptures tell us. Take a look. Proverbs says this: one person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, becomes a poverty. A generous person will be prospered. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. In 2 Corinthians, it says, look, those who sow sparingly will reap sparingly. God will bless you when your concern is for other people. What kind of blessings? I don't know. Probably all different kinds. I do know of one. Contentment. That's what Paul was showing. Because I'm concerned for you, not so much that you sent me a gift, thank you, but because God now is going to bless you, man, I am so content. I'm so content. That's the concept. Contentment is when you focus on other people. Now, what does that look like? Very quickly, I'm beginning to kind of wrap it up here. In Ephesians chapter 6, Paul makes reference to a guy there by the name of Tychicus. And he describes Tychicus with 3 adjectives that's about being concerned for others. First of all, he says he is a beloved brother. Now, what that means is this. He was just concerned about people. He was a good brother or sister in Christ because he was concerned about people. He wanted to know when people were hurting. He wanted to know if they were suffering and what he might be able to do to help them. So church, let's bring it into today. Let's bring it into application for you and I. The way that we are beloved brothers and sisters to each other is when we seek to understand and be aware of when other people are hurting. When we are concerned about people. When someone misses this church for 2 or 3 weeks, you are a beloved brother and sister in Christ when you pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, I've missed you. What's going on? Is there anything you need? Can I bring you anything? Can I take you anywhere? You're a beloved brother or sister in Christ and you are showing concern for others when you hear about someone that maybe is sick and you give them a call or you drop a card by. Or you stay alert to the needs of people in the church. We have a prayer list that goes on our website, do we not? It's out there every week, a prayer list. Go out there. Find out who's hurting. Find out who needs prayer. I'm amazed when people say to me, and I even had leaders at times say to me, I didn't know this person was sick. And I want to say, man, check out the prayer list. You do it. Because if you're a beloved brother and sister in Christ, you will. You'll want to. You want to know if someone's hurting so you can pray for them and say, you don't need me to be the beloved brother and sister for you. You need to be the beloved brother and sister. So you stay aware of when people are hurting. A second adjective he uses for him is that he's a servant. He serves. I love that. There are 2 types of people in the church. One type is when they walk into the church, the first thing they say is, I'm here, meet my needs. Do this, do that, so I'm happy, so I enjoy the church, so I love this, do it this way, sing this, make it this way. The other type of person is the one that walks in and says, I'm here, what need can I meet? What can I do? What can I teach? What can I fix? What can I paint? Where can I go? Who do you want me to call? They're always looking. Folks, right now we have a need in our VBS program because Kathleen Fisher was going to be one of our VBS teachers. She can't now. I don't think you want her back there with a cast on her leg with some pre-case. Maybe you do. I don't know. I don't know, but she can't. And so Christy is down one. Christy's also had someone else that's had to step out because of health reasons. We need teachers. There's a need. People that are concerned about others are ones that are willing to serve whoever is needed. The other adjective he uses is encourager. He was an encourager. He didn't complain. He didn't gripe. If things weren't exactly how he didn't want it, he still spoke positively about it. Now, we've talked about this before. Sometimes there are things we do have to battle about. There are some doctrinal issues that we have to talk about and we have to deal with. But most of the things that happen in the church are just matters of opinion. And the best thing you can be is an encourager, not pessimist. Encourage it, pray about it, speak good about it. Encourage others, speak good about others, don't speak negative about it. That's what it means to be focused on others. And once you become focused on others, then you're less focused on yourself and contentment begins to set in and you begin to be satisfied. Look at what it says in 1 Peter. Humble yourself, therefore, under God's mighty hand that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because of what? He cares for you. He sets the example. Contentment comes when we focus on others because focusing on others is Christ-like. I'm going to leave you with one more quote. I love this quote. It comes from a Greek writer around the time of 120 to 200 AD. somewhere in that neck of the woods, about 70 to 150 years after Christ. And this is what he writes about the church. It is incredible to see the fervor in which the people of that religion, talking about Christians, help others in their wants. They spare nothing. Do you realize what kind of a testimony it is when you are content? Do you realize how much you hurt your witness when you constantly walk around discouraged and frustrated and upset and negative and nothing's going right and all you can do is gripe and all you can do is complain because you have no satisfaction in your life, even though you are a child of the King of Kings that owns everything? And one of the reasons that you are discontent is because you're not concerned about others. And once we become concerned about others, it is a double positive witness. People see how you love others, and they see your contentment. And I don't know if there's any greater witness than that.